You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. This episode, we're having a round table panel discussion about the goth community on TikTok and social media's utility to the scene. Like, what kind of content does better on the platform, and how does the interaction with that content inform the values and conceptions of what goth is and how to be goth? How does that impact people getting into the scene and people that have been in the scene for a long time? We'll also discuss mainstream representation of goth, gender, and gatekeepers. So settle in for some traditional goth talk on this episode. Our guests this week include Kieran Creature. He's a member and contributor to the Colorado scene. If you remember back to our episode with Candace and Julian, he's part of that community. And they also produce engaging, education-focused goth content on TikTok. Dank Sinatra, likewise, puts out informational content on TikTok around being new to the scene, music recommendations, and social issues. And they're a listener to the podcast as well, which is always a special event for me when that happens. Pandora Ash posts lots of fun, silly goth content with a focus on goth dance, which is refreshing to see from them, considering most goth dance videos are parodies or jokes. And she's also a tattoo artist. And then Kimberly is our final guest and is joining us from Botswana. She shares delightful DIY, makeup, and cultural commentary goth content on her TikTok. And I also wanted to mention our last guest who had a last-minute scheduling issue preventing them from joining, but I wanted to mention Batsy1312, who also has a wonderful account to follow, all kinds of entertaining content. Of course, all the links to our guests' social media can be found in the show notes, so make sure to check those out. Of course, I am your host, Danny Ashes, and I'm here with my co-host, Trey. So with that said, what I like to do is get an introduction, get to know everybody, and usually the way I prompt that is just to say, kind of start with your origin story, I guess. Essentially, how did you discover goth, and then what resonated with you enough to keep you involved? So Kieran, if you want to start, that'd be great.
When I was about 14, so like 12-ish years ago, I discovered this CD box set from the library. I was actually looking for punk music at the time because I was really, really into punk in my teens. But it was this box set called Left of the Dial, Dispatches from the 80s Underground. And I thought, oh yeah, I can find like some like classic punk stuff through this. And I did find stuff like that. But I also found all this really cool goth stuff. I had, Bauhaus, The Cure, Sisters of Mercy, Exmal Deutschland, Susie and the Banshees, just like all kinds of things. I started listening to a lot of that stuff and I got really into it, but I didn't really consider myself a goth necessarily. And then this local art museum in my city called the Museum of Contemporary Art in downtown Denver had this whole series that they were doing on the early days of like punk, goth, and just alternative subcultures in the like late 70s, early 80s. And as a part of that series, they actually had an interview with David J.
Oh,
so
nice.
I went to that. I met him, and then he did like a whole DJ set afterwards, which was like phenomenal. So then I started getting really into that kind of music, but I still didn't really consider myself a goth. And then several years later, after I'd kind of dropped out of college, gotten back into it again, I started deciding to just actually dive into goth music like on purpose this time, because it hadn't really been on purpose initially. And I was just a little bit more fascinated with it. I'd always been fascinated with it, but I was kind of getting more fascinated with it like as an actual subculture instead of just the music at the time. So I started diving into it a little bit more on purpose. I got an opportunity to do like a whole academic project for a whole semester on literally any topic I wanted. So I decided to do it on music subcultures and learn more about goth through that. Started going to goth nights, and then the pandemic happened. So then I couldn't for a while. And then like late 2021, I started going back to things a little bit more. And at a She Passed Away show, I met like the members of Radio Scarlet afterwards because they had opened for them. And one of them, Anthony Van Schock, invited me to this thing that he and Natalie, who at the time they were together, had hosted, which is this goth night that still happens in Denver, although it's kind of hasn't happened in a little bit, but it's called Wake the Dead. And each one has a theme. So I went to that. And then from that, I met Julian Black, who I know you had earlier on your show, and then quite a few other people, and just sort of started making friends in the goth scene. So I kind of went from this place of like knowing a lot about like the music and the history of it, but knowing like nothing about the social aspects, and like being very knowledgeable in some areas and then being like just a baby bat in other areas and having like no idea for a while. So through that, I just kind of became like a part of my local scene and started getting to know people and had a really good experience with it.
And that's a really neat box set. I looked it up and it's got a really interesting bunch of bands.
Yeah, it has some really good music on it. So I went to Amoeba Records a couple of years ago, and I actually recognized that they were playing that specific box set because I recognized the order of the songs. But yeah, it's a really, really good one. I think somebody did put up like a Spotify playlist of all of it. So if it's like hard to find the box set, but you're interested in it, like I would definitely recommend looking it up because it's got some really good music on it.
Fantastic. Okay. Dank Sinatra, what about you?
Oh, goodness. How am I supposed to follow that up? So I would say around 2004 is when I started becoming interested in goth. Danny Phantom had just come out that year. And Sam, everyone in my school was basically enamored with her. I thought she was so cool, so pretty. In fact, she's part of the reason that I went like vegetarian back in the day. So it was really the first time I had heard the word goth. And a couple years later, I started calling myself goth, even though I didn't really know anything about it. And I think it was around 8th grade when I discovered Bauhaus, because I was doing a paper on the Bauhaus art movement. Went down that rabbit hole and then discovered bands like Jean Loves Jezebel, Red Lorry, Yellow Lorry, The Last Dance, which is still my favorite goth band to this day. But despite going down that rabbit hole, I discovered industrial, EBM, agrotech, and kind of went more Rivet Head for a while. Then came back around, I want to say 2010. My friend, who was also goth, he and I would share music and style tips and whatnot. And I went down the rabbit hole again, discovered more bands that I loved, and yeah.
That's really interesting. We have a lot of coming to goth from an academic perspective, because I similarly, after I was getting into goth, had some of the same interests, and I think that was kind of cultivated through I don't know if it's an expectation, but the proliferation of people in the scene that have more of an intellectual mindset when thinking about the world and their interests. So that's very interesting to hear that you both wrote papers on it when you were exploring the subculture. That's very cool.
Yeah, I think it's really neat that we both kind of came to goth based on schools, but from different points of view, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love coming to Bauhaus from the art movement, because it's a very left field turn.
Yeah.
Since they're only tangentially related.
Kind of a cool way to get into it, though, because so much of goth history has to do with art history as well.
Oh, yeah.
Which obviously is like why Bauhaus named themselves that. But like, yeah, that's a really cool way to get into it.
Yeah, especially since like they're like, we're not goths, we just make art rock.
Yeah, I was reading about, we're reviewing a Belgrado album later on this episode, or for the next episode, I don't know, whenever we record it. And that band had a lot of influence from like suprematism and abstract art and the Bauhaus school in their art and style as well, which I thought was interesting. Still, so it definitely persists today. All right, well, Pandora, what about you? What was your intro to goth?
Well, I have a little bit of a unique experience that I feel like is becoming more and more common nowadays. My mom has always been goth since goth really became any sort of mainstream over here, especially in the small town that she grew up in. She was one of the only goths in the 80s. Um, and so I've always had that influence there, but she never forced it upon me by any
Mhm.
means. I just kind of naturally fell into it. I was always a little weirdo, just like her. And she was always playing, new wave stuff. She was playing Flock of Seagulls around me, and then she would, dip her toes in. And obviously, The Cure was a big stepping off point for me.
Yeah.
Depeche Mode was a big one too. Um, and then she showed me My Chemical Romance, which just ruined me for a little while. Um, but she's been the biggest
Which album
source of
was it?
information.
Sorry.
She showed me Helena first
Okay.
because she
Yeah,
thought that I would like Gerard's makeup,
yeah.
and obviously I did.
Yep.
Obviously.
Yep.
But she's always been my biggest source of information when it comes to goth, and she's, done such a good job educating me when I've asked to be educated.
Yeah, that's amazing. I take a very similar approach to, because I have a 10-year-old, and he decided he wants to be goth. He said he enjoys the music and he enjoys the fashion and everything, but I also had a very similar, like, don't feel any pressure or expectations about how you want to express yourself or what your interests are, because I'm going to support you whatever you want to do. So, when he decides that he wants to be interested in something I'm interested in, that's a very like intimate, beautiful relationship. So
It really
yeah.
is. It really is. And I think that, like, allowing me that freedom and teaching me from such a young age that my appearance is the least important thing about me,
Mm.
I think that that gave me a stronger foundation for a lot of just like adult living that a lot
Mhm.
of people don't get. And I think it's funny that goth is so stigmatized because every goth I've ever met has been some of the nicest people I know.
Yeah, and it almost seems ironic as well, since goth is known for its spectacular style, to say, like, what, actually that's not the most important thing, right? It does.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
no,
not ironic because, to us, but it's from the outside, I'm sure it seems that way.
absolutely. Yeah, people can't look past something that seems a little odd to them.
Yeah. And then Kimberly, what about your introduction to goth?
Okay, so mine was mostly based off research, which was actually right after lockdown. So I had this playlist that had indie bands like The War on Drugs, one of my favorite bands actually, Pixies and Oasis, etc. But besides those bands was Lebanon Hanover. I hope I said that right. Which song? The song was Gallo Dance.
Yep.
I don't know how exactly that song got in the playlist, but yeah, it was there for a while, but I never really listened to the playlist, I mean the song, but it was, yeah, I never listened to it fully actually. Every time I played, I would just ignore it or anything. But at one point in my time, I was going through a really, really tough time. So I was listening to my playlist and that song came on. And yeah, the song came on and it really got my attention. I'd say mostly the lyrics. Yeah, the lyrics got my attention. But not only did the lyrics, I think the melody of the song, that's what really got my attention. And Larissa Ice Glass, the one who sang, I thought her voice was very beautiful. I think I was into that melancholic touch it had. It was beyond amazing when I was listening to it. And I was rather much impressed that one was able to sing about sorrows or other struggles in life, but trying to prevent that from fatally harming them by actually doing something that may distract them from being oppressed by our fallen world. or at least to say nature. So I got really invested in that song, and I explored more of their songs by Lebanon and Hanover. And I tried to research for other bands that were similar to them. But I think the next song that I listened to by Lebanon and Hanover was Babes of the Late 80s. And I watched the music video, and shall I say, I was very moved by it. I thought everyone in the video looked very cool, and they all looked free to be themselves around people that were accepting. Well, that's how I saw it to be. So I then invested in more bands like She Passed Away, Cellophane, Boy Harsher, Rosetta Stone, and so on. And as time went on, I discovered more bands, and I thought they were really interesting. I just wanted to explore more. And I thought, the thing is, I was more into grunge style before I actually got into goth. So I started to research more about these bands and everything. And I think not only was I into these, not only was I into the rock, but I then went into neoclassical dark wave, which really, really captivated my soul. That like bands like Dead Can Dance, Love is Colder Than Death. I was more into that actually. But besides that, I think yeah, I was more into the fashion, and I was more into how they would actually express their feelings in the songs, and just the melody of the songs and everything. I think it was very beautiful. So it really touched me.
That is beautiful. Yeah, I actually also similarly, when I was discovering goth music, once I found neoclassical, that was really something special for me, like Dinah Lachayan and Helium Vola and Dead Can Dance, that kind of thing. I'm very excited to hear everyone's perspectives on these topics. So let's just get into some of this stuff. Everyone, so I guess people listening don't know, but everyone that's on this episode, I invited through TikTok. And it seems, I've been on the app for maybe 4 years or so, but it seems like goth creators have been popping up a lot more and more recently on the app. Maybe it's just my algorithm finally catching up, but in the last couple months, I've seen an explosion of goth content, subcultural content, especially among people in high school and college, and just people getting into the scene recently. And obviously, you know, TikTok has its own specific dynamic that's different from YouTube or Instagram or Twitch. So I kind of wanted to talk about that to start off, and I guess maybe sharing your experience on TikTok as a content creator, and whether that's been positive or negative, how useful you think it is for the goth community, what types of content do better than others, even if it, you know, educational content, makeup content, lip syncing stuff, what your experience has been like is what I'm interested in. So yeah, Kieran, if you want to start.
I definitely think it's kind of a mixed bag. And this is just from my perspective as somebody who uses it more for educating people about things, as opposed to things like makeup tutorials or like lip sync and dances and things like that. I think it's a really good platform for those kinds of things, which is nice because I think it's a really great way of getting people engaged in it. And also because there are just a lot of incredibly talented goths on TikTok who do that kind of thing. But I do think that for me, from like an educating perspective, I think it's kind of a mixed bag because it's great for reaching a lot of people and it's great for like introducing people to concepts, but it's not very good for sharing nuance, going into depth, or like trying to avoid being misunderstood, just because for most users, you only get 3 minutes as like the maximum length per video. So it's kind of hard to really go into depth on certain topics. I would say like if you're like new to goth and you're like wanting to learn more about it, I would say avoid using exclusively TikTok to do that, just because it does have those drawbacks to it. But like I can definitely see a lot of value in it for just like introducing people to the subculture, even if it's just like somebody doing like a lip sync video or like just showing off an outfit or something like that just shows up on somebody's feed and they're like, wow, this is really cool.
Yeah.
Like, I want to learn more about that. Like, I think it's really good for that kind of thing. And I do think that has contributed to goth seeing sort of a resurgence in the past couple months or the past like couple years, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Doe, what about you?
So, due to the pandemic, a lot of people weren't able to go out and, meet other goths, go to goth clubs and goth meetups, what have you. I think that TikTok is a great resource for people who are, trying to get little bite-sized chunks of information. I always think that being in person and talking to multiple people that have been in the scene is always better. But coming from someone that A, works nights, B, is in school, and C, has rheumatoid arthritis, it's very hard for me to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to kind of give information to people who can't necessarily support the scene in person or get this information in person. And I think that TikTok is like the best way to do that, since shorter form content is on the rise and how most people interact with media now.
Yeah. Pandora?
I think that TikTok is definitely a resource in a lot of ways, but just like with any other topic, there's a lot of misinformation, and truthfully, a lot of people on TikTok are just there to be mad about something,
Yeah.
And so like my initial like surge of popularity happened right after Wednesday came out, and she had her little dancey do.
Mm-hmm.
And I made a video saying, like, goths have been doing this forever, and I like everyone knows that. Everyone knows that's where she got her inspiration. You would not believe the anger. Oh my God. You would think I said something horribly offensive. But I think that like creators like say awfully sinister or something, like there are so many creators on TikTok that add so much richness and education for baby bats that are in high demand at this point. There are so many that are just stepping into it. And I think that TikTok is awesome for stepping off, but you gotta find your own way. That's what it's about, man.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that a lot of the hate was coming from other goths, or was it just randos that ended up?
It's always the randos, and it's always the younger teenagers that really loved Wednesday, and that's okay. They're allowed to love Wednesday.
Yeah.
But just knowing the origins and being open to hearing about it rather than just refuting it because it doesn't sound like good to you.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's in abundance on TikTok, but there are lovely little pockets everywhere you look.
Yeah, it's also, I think, hard for some people when they're discovering something for the first time when they get all excited about, oh, this new thing, it's so interesting, and I have the source for it, and then to find out it's been done by other people for ages is really disheartening. And I think that's people get a really knee-jerk sort of negative reactions, like, no, I found this thing, it's my thing because I found the original and it was Wednesday. So I think that's part of where some of that anger comes from too, especially people who are just being introduced to a thing by this most recent pop cultural, artifact.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are defensive over what they love. They're protective over what interests them. It's understandable.
Kimberly, what's your experience been like on TikTok?
Honestly, my experience was not bad actually. I haven't come across some close-minded people in the community, but like everyone's saying, it is a very great resource of information from other people. And there are obviously a lot of people who aren't in the goth community who tend to be close-minded, of course. And these people, yeah, they are quick to judge, and sometimes their reactions will literally shock the crap out of you, because literally the way they can respond to someone who's goth in the community, or just someone who's goth, they tend to have a very negative response, which can sometimes be very hurtful to others. And it's really sad that this actually happens, because now this is what causes other people to just not be right mentally, because it can mess with some people mentally, but sometimes people just don't take it to heart because they know that these people are ignorant and not willing to learn, because we all live in a society where we just have to accept these kind of behaviors, if not accept and just delete it out of our minds. But yeah, it's even worse to be faced with racist comments from for people of color. People act like there's never been a person of color in the community, when in fact we have been in this community for literally since the beginning. So
Yeah.
it's quite an experience, actually, good and bad. But yeah.
Yeah, I think the way that TikTok sort of, I guess because it's such an even playing field, you get people who feel like, oh, I have power in this situation to say something shitty. Whereas if it was at a club, or if it was in a, the Gothic takeover at Lakeside setting, there's a way for the community to filter that stuff out and not run into those issues as much, or deal with them more efficiently when they do happen. I guess that's kind of a question I was going to ask around that difference between in-person and online interactions and the way those are prioritized, because I know in the past there's been a tension between being chronically online and being part of a physical local scene, kind of all the way back to the 90s net goth days, and even up till the last few years with YouTubers talking about, get your impressions of what goth is from your local community rather than the internet. But when thinking about and interacting with TikTok or other online communities, if you feel like, is there a prioritization of saying, hey, interact and support your local scene? And is there a difference with the way you experience the community and the connection to the scene online or not?
So I know, I've definitely talked before about how, I think if you have access to a local scene, it's definitely something worth engaging with. It is a really good way to interact with a lot more people, just because I think a lot of the goths I know in my local scene aren't really online at all. It's a good way to meet people from older generations of goths, because a lot of them aren't really online as much, although there are obviously a few. And also just because in my experience, the local scene, it has its drama, but overall, I feel like I experience a lot less toxicity from people there. But that being said, I also think that a lot of people will talk about different barriers to being able to engage very much with your local scene that I think are also important to talk about, because I think some people have this mindset that if you're not engaging with your local scene, or if you don't have a local scene to engage with, that you're not a real goth. And I think that's a really toxic mindset to have, just because there are these barriers. Obviously not everybody lives in an area where they have access to that. If you're underage, you might not really have very much access to it. I know that's one of the reasons that Candy came up with the Gothic takeover at Lakeside in the first place, is that
right.
Going to clubs is just not accessible for everybody. It's not an option for people who are underage. It can be an issue in terms of disability, alcohol being everywhere. And also just harassment from non-goths. I feel like online you can kind of block people and just ignore it. In person, sometimes they don't really want to let you do that. But that being said, I think I've also met a lot of really, really cool people in my local scene, and had a lot of opportunities to have really cool experiences and to go to really cool shows and things like that, because I am fortunate enough to be in a place that has a local scene that I can access. So I would say that if it's an option, it's good And it's absolutely worth doing. And I think that there is some emphasis on that, but I also think it's important to kind of balance that out with this understanding that like, just because somebody can't necessarily engage in their local scene doesn't necessarily mean that they're less of a goth than people who can. Because I do think that you can make really meaningful connections with people online, and you can still like be a very knowledgeable member of the subculture as somebody who primarily participates online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also echoing kind of what you were saying earlier with the disparity between the amount of drama or anger between an online community versus a real life community. I think part of that is with a lot of the online communities, how they grow and develop is through engagement. And usually one of the best ways for people to get engagement is to, whether real or not, engage in drama or things that are going to invoke an extreme emotional reaction, because then someone will engage with that because they have to respond to this thing that makes them angry.
Clickbait.
Or is dramatic. Yeah, you've got your clickbait, you've got, all that stuff. And a lot of that is, the algorithms with all these apps tend to, put that front and center on everyone's feed because they know that that's what gets the eyeballs and the engagement that gets them their clicks. And I think that's part of what makes some of these online communities a little bit more fraught than in person.
Mm-hmm. That's why people hate watch Jake Monroe, for example. Well, Do, what about, do you have thoughts on the difference in experience between in-person and online, or if there's any kind of preference, like people talking about go out and experience goth or just do it online, that kind of stuff?
So, piggybacking off of what Karen said, yeah, I do think that if you have the ability to, it's something that you should experience, even if it's just one time. If you don't, obviously you can't really do anything about that. You can kind of try to start like a meetup with a couple friends that might have the same interests as you. But if you have to engage mostly online, that's perfectly fine. And no one should ever make anyone feel terrible because, they can't make it out of their house for one reason or another. It's important to remember that most people in general, not even just goths, are interacting with people mostly on the internet. Even if it's someone that they know in real life, most people are, texting or Skyping, not Skyping. Oh my gosh, I'm showing my age. But most people are, interacting online now. And if we didn't interact on the internet, the scene wouldn't be as big as it is now, since it's seeing that resurgence.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no comments, Pandora. You have any thoughts?
I do. I mean, like Kieran also mentioned this. A lot of goths that I know are disabled, and including myself, I'm chronically ill. I have, chronic pain conditions. And so even though there is a resurgence in my local scene is pretty small, but we're seeing more and more goth nights pop up around town. And it's just not accessible for everybody to expel the physical energy to get ready and then go and then dance, because you gotta dance.
Yep.
But it's just, I think that goth is about like including the dark and the macabre in life, and that includes people who have illnesses. Accessibility, I think, is super important when it comes to goth culture.
Yeah, I agree. I know my wife has multiple chronic illnesses as well, and that's, takes a lot of time, and everybody and people who are older might have kids or multiple jobs. I have like 3 jobs, so yeah, definitely agree with that. Kimberly, what about you? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think for me, it's just unfortunate that there aren't any goths in my area, or at least none that I know about. But I live in a very small country, so I don't actually come across any goth. I think the only place I can find goths is our neighboring country, which is literally more than 400 kilometers away, and it's quite expensive to travel the country. So I mostly just interact with people online, and it's quite hard not to interact with goths in person, because I would really love to have that experience with someone, just be able to connect with someone on a, personal level, person to person. And yeah, but other than that, I think the people who I'm friends with online, they're very nice, and I actually do appreciate them because they're all very respectful. So I think for me, I guess I'm just I guess I just gotta wait to leave the country because not even bands actually, bands don't come here. No one actually performs here. So I'm literally just alone here, like watching everyone just go to other clubs. I get really jealous because I wish I could actually experience that. But yeah, I am soon to experience that though, because I do wish to leave the country soon. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point as well. There's, everybody, the last few months, or not everybody, the last few months or so, people have been going to like Cruel Worlds or Wavegoat to Treffen, and there's certainly a barrier there as well that, some people just can't do that, can't make that happen. So kind of along those lines, again, with online communities, there's, it seems like everyone here was introduced, or the substance of their interest in goth came through music primarily. There's always been this, not always, but there's this concern around, whether too many people in the scene or getting introduced to goth are going to care only about fashion and not care about the music or the right kind of music. Kind of all the way back to like maybe the Cure heads would be an example of people in the 80s that were seen as not really part of the scene, even though they looked like they were, because they were just into the, dressing up like Uncle Bob. So I wonder, considering the heavy focus on music through TikTok and the explosion of new artists in the scene the last few years, if you think like general emphasis on the core of goth is around music, or if you think the visual nature of social media still puts an emphasis on appearance and aesthetic and that kind of thing.
I mean, I definitely think that appearance is emphasized, at least to some degree. I think it's maybe getting a little bit better than it was when I first, because like I remember even before I started really intentionally trying to explore goth, like when I was still more into punk stuff, I was kind of like a punk with very goth adjacent interests. And I remember a lot of the goth stuff that I did see online either had like barely any attention or was just all about like fashion and aesthetics. But I have also noticed a really big pushback against that. And I also think like, especially with the more like within the past year, the more recent resurgence that we've been having, it does seem like there is at least some more emphasis on music, because we've had so many more bands come out and people getting big who like aren't necessarily like getting big for their aesthetics. It's more like they're getting big for things like knowledge of music. I've definitely seen people get big because they were like elder goths, or people like Awfully Sinister, where it's more, about educating people about the music and having like a broad knowledge of that. And I think like in Awfully Sinister's case, like I think the fact that he's also like actually a DJ, like a goth DJ, I think that also has contributed to him getting big. I think you look at like Goth Dad from Vision Video, and yeah, it's like part of it is that it's kind of like a bit like it's, trying to be sort of funny, but he does it in a way that he's trying to educate people about goth and very much also about the music because he's in a goth band. So I do think that there is some pushback against that kind of thing, but at the same time, there is some influence, or some emphasis on having this flawless appearance, on being really good at makeup, regardless of what gender you are. I think a lot of the people that you see get really big within goth tags have for a while been, pale, skinny, able-bodied, not visibly queer or trans. And I think that that can be kind of an issue because it does promote bigoted attitudes. Like I know for a while there was this whole thing about like certain people insisting that if you weren't white, you weren't pale enough to fit the goth aesthetic, which I know even Tim Burton like said that, which is just insane.
Yep.
But like, I think if you actually like look at what the goth community is actually like, and I mean, this is just based on like my own experience with like in-person goth events, but also like just the people that I've met online through being more focused on the music. I think it's pretty obvious that most goths don't have this perfect, flawless appearance, at least not in the way that is expected to be like that. Like goths, a lot of goths have visible disabilities, like we were talking about. A lot of goths are visibly queer or trans. A lot of goths aren't skinny. A lot of goths aren't white. Like it's like you can be a goth and very much look like a goth without looking like the goths who get big on like Instagram. And I think like in some corners of TikTok. And I think that that is still a problem, but there has been pushback against that because so much of the goth community doesn't fit those aesthetics. And also because a lot of people within the goth community just don't really think that aesthetics should be the most important thing at all. I think like at least the corners of the goth internet that I try to confine myself to, it tends to be more focused on the music. But I think that's also just, you know, I have to curate those spaces for myself. And I think that it's easy to forget that there are communities out there where it's all about having the most perfect kill star fashion aesthetic and not about the music as much.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think, you know, even people like, I mean, this has been a perpetual problem. In more recent years, we've had people writing into, like you mentioned, Killstar, saying, hey, we need better representation in your models and that kind of thing. Or, you know, people like It's Black Friday doing videos like skin lightening videos, that kind of shit. Definitely that is an element. Well, I don't want to share my thoughts. I want to hear everyone else's thoughts. Thanks, Sinatra. What's your take on this?
Not too long ago, I think it was like maybe, I want to say January, I actually responded to a comment that said something like Black goths have shaky makeup 99% of the time.
Disgusting.
And it wasn't even on my video, but I was like, this is just ridiculous. Like the idea that a certain race of goths has to have shaky makeup is just so mind-blowing to me. Like I have to laugh at it because it's just, how does anyone think that ever? It's a skill that like you develop with time, and a lot of society is basically just like, if you're Black, you can't be goth. So a lot of Black goths with quote unquote shaky makeup are going to be new. They did get dragged and they did delete their comment, but the sentiment is still there. That person still has that idea. And anyways, sorry, I went off on a tangent for a little bit.
No, that's fine.
But I feel like being in the subculture for a longer amount of time is something that's seen as a positive. I don't really think that is necessarily a negative. That's just human nature. People are going to be more, I guess, accepting of the knowledge and the information that they're getting from somebody who is seen as an authority figure. That's literally, that transcends goth. That's something that I think there were like multiple experiments done on this.
I personally have always been taught that it's about the music. Like I said before, you know, my mother taught me that the way I looked was the least important thing about me, no matter what subculture I'm in. But I think that there definitely is an amount of misinformation, just because a lot of these baby bats that are getting into it that start with their interest in the fashion, you know, the algorithm favors them for sure. And so that gets a lot more representation than, say, you know, we were talking about elder goths earlier. They definitely do get some attention, but, you know, per capita, generally speaking, you see a lot of younger, able-bodied goths on social media in general, whether it be TikTok, Instagram, or otherwise. I think that it's a pretty solid consensus for anyone who has genuinely dipped their toes into goth beyond the fashion that it is about the music. And it is about being open with your emotions and finding eloquent and beautiful and macabre ways to express that however you see fit, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I would definitely say that the line is not drawn on anyone's physical appearance. Like, speaking on, like, obviously I'm a white presenting person, I'm white passing. But seeing the amount of racism towards different goths of color throughout the community is just, it's so disheartening because it's never been about that. And anyone who is really here for what it's about knows that, you know?
Yeah.
I think what Snatcher said about the shaky makeup and not having that perfect makeup is, I do agree with that. And it's crazy how people may be quick to just tell you that you may not be goth enough because you don't have the perfect trad goth makeup, because trad goth is the one that's mostly popular. So if you don't have trad goth makeup that's perfect, or teased hair with the perfect box eyebrows, then you're either just not goth enough, or you're just not goth enough, which this could actually just drive people away from the scene because of how people may tend to judge others on how they may not be meeting the standards of goth. So I wouldn't blame them also, because I think I've seen someone else that just decided not to try the goth scene because people were just, being rude about their appearance, on how they do their makeup and all that. And when it comes to music as well, for example, with Baby Bats, they could still be going into the music and learning more about the music, but when as they're still learning, some people may just be quick to assume that they do not know goth music, or they're just not really goth because they're just starting off with easy bands, or just mainstream bands. So it's like, oh, you're not really you're not really into the scene that much because you're not listening to this and that, or this and that, because baby bats are still experiencing, or just experimenting and going through the goth music and everything. So I think that people shouldn't be so quick to judge, because this can also go to gatekeeping, because I know that this would actually drive people to actually not want to take part in the scene anymore. So it's, I also just think I think it's also crazy that people can actually get really shocked when they see a Black person that's goth. Like, they would actually get shocked and like, how are you Black and goth? Make that make sense.
Yeah.
It's
That shit pisses me off.
It does.
I feel like personally, if people are respectful about the fact that, most people have never seen Black goths before, if they're respectful and they're like, wait, I thought that was only for white people, like, of course, you can kind of tell the difference if someone's being like, that's a white people only subculture. And I've never seen a Black goth before. I didn't think this was a thing that Black people were into. Like, you can kind of tell the difference between that. And if you're respectful about it, most people are going to be very respectful back towards you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's usually pretty easy to see someone who's just honestly confused because they're experiencing something for the first time that bucks their preconception, versus someone who is trying to enforce a proscriptive idea of what the subculture should be, and is wanting to exclude this type of person because they don't match that ideal that they feel is crucial to the core of the community.
Yeah.
I also just think something that a lot of people tend to forget about is the fact that goth exists on every continent.
Yeah.
There are goth scenes all over the world. There are goths all over the world. Goth music has a huge tendency to have a variety of languages in it. Like a lot of bands will use more than one language, like in a single song. Like I know Cellophane uses, I think, like 4 languages, depending on what they think works best for the song. And like, I think most people who are in like a lot of countries like the US or the UK who are listening to things like She Passed Away or Molchat Doma don't actually speak Turkish or Russian, but they still enjoy that music. And I think it's important to be able to extend that like acknowledgement of the diversity of goth to countries that aren't just European. And understanding that places like, for example, Latin America has like a huge amount of really, really good goth music that's mostly in Spanish that I think often gets a little bit ignored by people who don't speak Spanish. I think it's important to keep in mind that like goth has never been something that existed exclusively in Europe or like in white communities within the US. It's never been exclusively from those places. And even if we look at like the beginnings of goth, you listen to Bela Lugosi's Dead, which a lot of people kind of treat as the start of goth. And that song, literally, like Bauhaus have been very open about this. That is one of their songs that has a lot of influence from Jamaican dub music that comes from Black culture. And I read like a whole thing about when the producer was recording and producing that song, he did it in the style that he would a dub band. I think it's really important for us to remember that like goth has never been exclusively a white people's thing. So obviously there are going to be goths who aren't white and who, you know, are Black or who are from other parts of the world. And I think a lot of goths don't remember that as often as they should.
Yeah, along those same lines, there was a story, I don't know how necessarily true it is, but back in the 80s when with Skinny Puppy, not a goth band per se, but at least tangentially related, when they were getting popular and they went to a radio station at live for the first time, and the people at the radio station were just surprised that this band wasn't made up of black members, just because they had a lot of that sort of the early days of hip hop and electro funk in their music, that people were assuming sight unseen that, oh, this must be a Black band. So it just, you know, more of a testament to the roots of the music being, you know, inundated with this mix of multiple different cultures with a lot of heavy influence from traditional Black cultures and Black art movements in the 70s and 80s. And I also wanted to mention the whole idea that goth has developed, you know, has spread its seed to all the different continents out there for the most part, and there's a goth scene everywhere, is a testament to the sort of universality of this experience, or this core ideals of goth that's just universal to the human experience, not related to a European cultural idea or something that is, you know, white or anything. Both the aesthetic and the ideology and the music can resonate with people from all different cultures all over the world. And I personally think that's a great thing about the goth culture itself.
Yeah.
Can I bounce off of
Please.
that a little bit? And like goth itself as a whole has always been entrenched with outcasts, whether that be minorities of, you know, race-wise, or LGBT people have been in the goth community since goth started, you know. It's always been a diverse subculture, and I don't know where this idea came from that it has to be kept away.
Well, it came from white supremacy, but yeah.
Yeah,
I get what you mean.
Of course
Yeah.
it did. I mean, like, I don't know it, and the first time that it was brought up in our modern culture by a specific source.
Yeah.
But one second, I'm having a brain fart, but I had something very poignant to say. I can promise you that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the bands we were talking about, Latin America and
yeah,
Asian countries. Like I know there's Camland from Indonesia, for example. There's music all over the world, right?
Yeah, no, I remember what I was going to say now.
Yes.
I was going to touch on like a very commonly used symbol for trad goths is an ankh, which is not a symbol that was created by white people. Like it's so overt that it has never been that way, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, body modification and hairstyles that are drawn from indigenous African cultures and that kind of thing. Like this sort of the whitewashing is a problem.
I was going to say Western European culture has done its damnedest to whitewash Egypt, though.
Yeah.
I mean, traditional pictures or artistic representations of like Cleopatra, she's generally white.
Yeah.
As ridiculous as that is, but that's sort of the whitewashing that Western European that we've done for that whole
and like
culture.
Cleopatra, we actually don't know who her mother was. Like we know who her father was. He was Macedonian with like some Persian ancestry, but we don't know who Cleopatra's mother was. So it is very, very well within the realm of possibility that she was Black, because if she was from Egypt, she probably would have been North African and thus Black. And Cleopatra was actually, I believe, the first Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, and only one, I guess, who actually spoke Egyptian. She also spoke a lot of other languages, so we don't necessarily know. But like, I think like obviously, like Netflix's whole docuseries, which I haven't actually seen, but like people freaked out about the casting decision for that. And there hasn't been anywhere near as much backlash for Gal Gadot being cast as Cleopatra for an upcoming project. Yeah. And I think it's pretty clear with figures like that. Sorry to go off on a completely unrelated tangent, but I think with figures like that, the way that people get about racial ambiguity and about even the possibility that somebody like that may have been Black is like, people do it in the goth scene just as much as they do it everywhere else. Like, we're not better than everybody else about that kind of thing just because we're alternative. And in fact, thinking that, I think, causes more problems. Excuse me, sorry.
Right, because
it
lets us not have to engage with it because we think we've fixed it. Because we're already outcast, we're all accepting, and that is just factually untrue. Yeah.
I just wanted to add my thought on the music element of TikTok before we move on. I do think it's interesting the way TikTok uses music in a couple ways. I think, the obvious example is Molchat Doma, right? Because not many people knew about that band, and then they had this explosion in popularity through TikTok that kind of allowed them to do international tours and that kind of thing. We mentioned Lebanon Hanover, that they had a resurgence because of TikTok. We mentioned Dusty, who kind of built the popularity of Vision Video on the back of his TikTok skits. Urban Heat is another example. The Mission had a kind of thing going for a little while. Even huge bands like The Cure that everybody knows, the way that their music was used on TikTok, I think got people talking about their music and new goths getting into and interested in their music. And so I think it's interesting the way music is integrated through TikTok, because it's not necessarily the classical way we would talk about music, like at a club or from a journalist or a music outlet. That does happen on TikTok, right? We mentioned Awfully Sinister. But I think more often the way music is being presented is people run into a song or part of a song that resonates with them, and then they go and do research on that on their own, which is kind of how, maybe not the way it should be, but my experience getting into goth through music, kind of I heard one song on a sampler CD, and it was the only goth song there, and it was completely different from anything I'd heard before. And so I kind of fell in love with this one song, and then spent a lot of time trying to discover what else sounded like this, what else was attached to this sound. And so in that sense, I feel like TikTok is kind of a return to the old way of discovering music, because there is that sense of random chance and discovery when you come across a video that has a song that hits you in a certain way, that makes you feel certain things. It feels like you've stumbled onto something special. Obviously, it doesn't actually work like that because they have these sophisticated algorithms and things. But I feel like it is a modern way of discovering music that's very classic in a sense.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
It's a modern evolution to some degree of both the college radio or independent radio subculture that really blew up a lot of bands in the 80s and to a degree the 70s, as well as the aspect that really got me into it, other than just personal recommendations, but the idea of compilations. TikTok is a wonderful virtual online compilation CD or sampling station that you're by default skipping from track to track. You don't have to listen to whole tracks.
Right.
You get like this curated core section that this is the exciting thing on the track, and if that grabs you, then you can look at it more broadly, but you don't have to spend the time and also the money gambling on, oh, this is an interesting name or an interesting album art, let me buy this record, and you may or may not like it, or you may just like one album on the whole, or one track on the album. Whereas with something like TikTok, it's a single button click away to go next.
Yeah. Okay, so I kind of along the lines of what we were talking about with the way goth is presented in online spaces, is this, I guess it's a perennial concern. I haven't heard it talked about very much in the last year or two, but it certainly has been a big issue for some people at certain times, is this idea of the presentation of goth as a bunch of categories, and then this fear that when people get into the community, they're going to think they have to pick one aesthetic subtype of goth to form your identity around. Like we mentioned trad goth, or like death rock, cyber goth, goth core, goth grunge, whatever. So I wonder, in your experience, if you feel like that is actually a thing, or are people more into just mixing and matching, or it's just kind of like a joke, or how you feel about that?
I was always under the impression that had started out as kind of a joke.
Mm-hmm.
But people do definitely take it seriously, at least online. I haven't really seen very much of that in person, just like in my own scene. I don't know if it's different elsewhere. Except me, like there are some people who maybe identify as like death rockers, but like still goths, and I think that's more just to do with the type of music that they listen to, because they just listen to more death rock. But generally speaking, other than that, I think it's more of a thing online than it is elsewhere. But I also feel like a lot of the time, the types of people who treat it as a serious thing, also treat it as though, like, if you're not specifically a trad goth, that you're maybe like a poser, or you're less serious about it, which just isn't really how it's ever actually worked. But I think a lot of the time, the people who are under that assumption are people who are very new, who maybe just haven't had a whole lot of experience to tell them otherwise. Because I do think that even online, I think if you've been a part of the goth community for a long enough time, you stop really taking that kind of thing seriously.
Yeah, so personally, I prefer a trad goth style, but that's it. I consider myself a goth. I don't say like I'm a trad goth, but I grew up in the mid to late 2000s. Tumblr was starting to get popular, and new goth was really starting to pop off around then. So I feel like my style is trad goth, new goth, death rock elements. No one really should feel a need to pick a style and stick with it forever. Like I said, that wasn't really a thing when I first started out. And around, I want to say like the 80s and the 90s, those goths, they didn't really have fast fashion like that. So they would just take whatever was popular at the time, or whatever they had, and DIY it, which is why I think that's still important to the culture today.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think that in like modern times, there's a little bit of a pressure from social media to classify yourself, but I think that mostly comes from just people wanting to put labels on things so they can understand them. I've been in waves throughout my whole life, just testing different styles, and I like to say you can't put Pandora in a box. you know? I feel like that would be a disservice to me. And I feel like really just as a human, putting restrictions on yourself like that for something that's supposed to be a form of self-expression is just counterintuitive. And I feel like the people that genuinely do care about that stuff are either purists or they don't know what they're talking about, you know?
Yeah. Yep.
I think baby bats tend to feel pressured into picking an aesthetic in the goth style. I think specifically trad goth. I do love trad goth actually. Yeah. I think it's just that I think they should not be bothered by people that would come at them for not being dressing too goth or just in a darker look or yeah, just in a darker look. But this actually usually consists of the teased hair, as I mentioned before, and yeah. But once people do get into goth, they start to learn about it and they may want to explore on the different types of goth style, which is fine. But because this broadens one's sense of belonging on what they feel mostly suits their personality or which they mostly feel comfortable with and expressive. So with me, I like to switch it up myself, whatever suits my mood. I dress up how I feel is okay for my mood right now. So one can pick one you can pick up one identity and stick to it, which is also good. And some people do prefer to explore before they actually get to choose one specific thing that they may stick with, or people may just want to try different things and explore, which is also good.
Yeah.
So when people do that, some may think that maybe they're just, I'd say maybe a poser or just, yeah, it's just something that can actually broaden your creativity as well, because no one has to feel pressure into picking what exactly they feel like they belong in a style. It's up to you really, because it's your own creativity on how you choose it to be. Because you see, the fun thing about being goth is that it's more of a DIY thing. So you get to create your own thing and you get to create how you want to look. And it's really a beautiful thing about being goth also, it's all within you.
Yeah.
I just have something real quick here.
Yeah.
For me, I mean, I've talked about this on a lot of different topics, but I'm a big fan of sort of taxonomies and classifications and things like that. But the way I approach them is that's how I discover things. When I experience something, whether I see it in an aesthetic or a fashion, whether I hear it in a music genre, or I'm experiencing it as part of an art movement, having a name, having a label, having a tag for it means that, oh, I really like this thing I experienced. What's it called? Let me search for it. Let me find other things like it. It makes that aspect of things easier. But I don't like viewing that classification then as a prescriptive requirement, something that dictates what you're supposed to like, what you're supposed to do, or that any given piece, any given aesthetic look that an individual has put together, or a song or album that a musician has put together, needs to fit wholly in that box. In fact, I usually like things more that don't fit in the box. They have elements of it and you can see them picking and choosing different things, because personally I love when people mix and match things and put things, especially things that seem like they're at odds or butting heads. If they can merge them together, I find that to be fascinating. So when I was first getting into goth, it was in the 90s, and that was sort of the initial rise to my understanding of that sort of goth taxonomy, the classifications with your trad goths and your romantic goths and your perky goths and all that stuff was a big thing on Usenet in the 90s. And what I like to do is when I'd go out to the club night on any given week, I would sort of choose, what classification do I want to go in this week? And I'll just sort of play with different aesthetics, different weeks, because I like looking different. I don't like to always have the exact same look every time I go out. And then I'll also like to experiment with, maybe I'll do some jewelry from this aesthetic, but clothing from this aesthetic, colors from this aesthetic. and kind of mix and match that way. And that's always how I've enjoyed it. And that's how I like, my music too. When I hear bands that are pulling and merging different things into one, that usually makes me the most excited. And I mean, if you've listened to some of my reviews historically on this, I tend to shit on bands that seem to be just sort of boxing themselves into a very specific aesthetic. Where I tend to be a lot more excited when I'm experiencing something that seems to mix a bunch of things in, and I can't classify them.
Yeah. I did want to say, because trad goth has been brought up so many times, I do think it is kind of funny that it's so popular now, to the point where people are complaining about trad goth being too popular or being the default, because that was such a, I remember when everybody was upset about, we mentioned new goth or pastel goth or whatever, and that was the thing. Everyone was like, nobody uses trad goth aesthetic anymore, and it was such a small subset of fashion, and now it's huge. And of course, it's not even, it kind of implies it's a one-for-one recreation of the 80s or something, but it's not, obviously, right? It has its own sensibilities that are kind of modern. Even the 90s fashions were, maybe if they were pulling from the 1800s or whatever, it was still highly influenced by the current fashion trends. So it's just kind of an interesting thing to me. But yeah, so I did want to ask kind of another frustration that has become increasingly common, I think, the last 15 years or so, 10 years maybe, is the experience of seeing someone out in the world or even online that kind of checks all the boxes of presenting as goth, but then when you actually talk to them or learn about them, you kind of realize you don't have anything in common with them and they're not actually goth. So I was wondering if you think there are trends in mainstream music or fashion that are annoyingly misrepresenting goth or being labeled as goth. We already brought up the show Wednesday, which is part of that potential frustration, or if there are any bands that get called goth that aren't that kind of thing, if you see that happening.
I really don't love it when goth is used as like a marketing term, because it does kind of commodify the subculture and create this image of it in a lot of people's minds that isn't necessarily accurate. When I did do like academic research on music subcultures, what I ended up finding and concluding with it was that ultimately commodifying a subculture can kill it. And that's something that like the subcultures that have survived for as long as they have done so because they have found ways of resisting that commodification. I think a lot of this, I think, was like a really big thing with like the 2000s, with like emo basically being marketed as goth. And I think that's why a lot of goths, like especially ones who were like maybe teenagers during that time period, get really, really angry if somebody calls them emo, which is interesting just because I know so many goths who like either were emo or like still are into emo music. Like, I don't think that, I don't know, that's a whole other conversation. But
Yeah.
I do think though that it can create a lot of issues because that's how you get things like you have to fit a certain aesthetic in order to be a goth. And things like music that's not goth being advertised as goth and then causing a lot of confusion both for goths and for people who are into that music who then don't know what goth music means, and it just creates a whole problem. I've also encountered a number of people online who have this weird tendency, and I think it's like I think it comes from like Jake Monroe or something like that, but it might also just be their own thing, but like people who identify as goth and very, very like insistent that they are goth. But then they like, when you actually bring up goth music, they'll have like a whole tangent prepared about why they think goth music sucks. And they'll make all these like disparaging remarks about it. Like I remember this one person that just like commented completely unprompted on like a post that I made on Tumblr recommending goth music about vampires. And this person had just commented on it and had this whole rant about how much goth music sucks and said like, oh, I hate these low falsettos. And I'm like, what is
Oh boy.
low falsetto? What does that even mean? But like, you know, I mean, those kinds of people I think are kind of not as common as they maybe used to be. But you do get things like that where people think, oh, well, I don't have to listen to the music to be goth then because all I have to do is fit the certain aesthetic that's been marketed to me as what goth is. And I do think that that can be a problem because it does commodify the subculture and make it more difficult for people who might have an interest in the subculture to really discover it, hear the music, learn what it's about, and really start actually participating in the subculture, which can be a danger to future generations being able to find out about it and therefore a danger to the subculture's longevity. On the other side of it, though, I also see people who will who are goths who will claim ownership over things that have been marketed as goth, even if they aren't really. Like I know when Wednesday came out, I saw adults just like ripping into teenagers because these teenagers had like made playlists that they were like, oh, this is a Wednesday Addams themed playlist. And nowhere in their like description of it or title or anything did they say this is a goth playlist. But I saw adult goths ripping into them and being like, but this isn't goth music. And it's like, well, if they're not saying that it is, then it doesn't really have to be. Like if they think that Billie Eilish fits this character, like, you know, maybe they're right. Who are we to say otherwise? They never said it was goth. So we, you know, it's okay to let them enjoy that.
Yeah.
If they're not saying that it's, you know, I think like people have this tendency to just sort of be like, oh yeah, well, you can like all these like aesthetic things and all these other things that are a part of goth subculture without necessarily calling yourself a goth if you don't listen to the music, which fine, I don't disagree with that. But then if those same people are going to turn around and get angry at people for liking those things and not listening to goth music, even if they're not calling themselves goth or whatever, like you can't have it both ways, you know, because it just gets really hypocritical with that. And I think like if we're going to like say like, yeah, goth is essentially a music-based subculture and music is ultimately the most important part of it, then I think we need to make sure that we're not getting upset at people if they're not claiming to be a part of the subculture, but they're into other things that aren't about the music that we're also into by coincidence because it happens to be dark and spooky, you know?
So I actually get this question a lot on TikTok. It's, can I still dress this way even if I don't particularly like goth music? And I'm like, I don't really care. Honestly, I'm not going to say you can't dress a certain way. Like, who am I? But like it's perfectly fine if you it's a cool style. Like it's neat. Like I have no issues as long as you're not saying like, yes, I am a goth and you're like taking over, you know, goth nights and goth clubs, which I don't see why you would, because if you don't like goth music, why are you going to a goth club? But like it doesn't necessarily bug me in terms of like shows like Wednesdays. It doesn't bug me in the sense that, you know, people are gonna call themselves goth because of it. Like I feel like that's just an issue that isn't as big as people are gonna make it seem necessarily. But it bugs me in the sense of how people expect goths to react or how to act. So growing up, at least, people would expect me to act like Wednesday Addams just because I looked a certain way. But then they talk to me and they're like, you're always smiling. Why are you always smiling? You're not supposed to do that. They're like, you're secretly preppy because you laugh at everything and you have a sense of humor and you don't look at the world with like dread. Like, I'm sorry, I didn't know I was supposed to do that. In terms of music and things like that, I think it was Angela Benedict that she went to a club and it was advertised as being goth and they played like one Sisters of Mercy song and nothing else was goth. And it's like, why would you shouldn't advertise something as goth if you're just going to play one goth song. Like you wouldn't say we're going to have a metal night and you just play hip hop and then one Metallica song and then the rest is hip hop. It seems like goth is the only subculture where it's okay to do that. And that bugs me. Yeah. But I think that most of the people that are going to watch Wednesday and call themselves goths because of it are children. And like children don't bug me. Like I just think that those people, we should kind of be like, hey, it is music based. Here's some songs, and kind of, hold their hand and guide them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's certainly not a new concern with the kind of music that are played at events or the way they're advertised, I guess. Like, I know, just for an example, when I was getting into goth in the early 2000s, a lot of the music that I was exposed to was synth pop and future pop and that kind of thing, because that's what was being played at the clubs. And I mean, that was due to a lot of different factors. That style just became popular. Goth clubs couldn't necessarily support just being goth nights because there weren't enough people at that point coming out to nights like that. So they had to diversify and get the industrial crowd. And I mean, we've always kind of shared spaces with the industrial scene. And so that's always been a thing where people are putting goth on the flyer to get the goth crowd and then not really playing goth music. There was a goth night at Medusa's near me where I live. It's defunct now, but ran for a long time. And every time I went, it was like 90% techno music. Techno,
Agrotech,
electronic, agrotech, yeah, synth pop. Almost no goth music, but all the goths that were in the area went to it because that was the closest place to go that wasn't in Chicago, which is harder to, it's a big city. It's harder to get to stuff if you don't live there. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I think in her video, she said like they didn't even play industrial or EBM. It was literally just like, it was, I can't remember specifically what genre she said, but it wasn't anything even close to adjacent.
I vaguely remember that video. I don't remember specifically what she was talking about either, but I do remember her talking about something like that.
So Pandora, what are your thoughts about the way goth is portrayed in popular media or anything that's been talked about?
Well, I think my main issue goes back to what Kieran was talking about with the commodification of goth and using it as like a buzzword, like we had Lil Peep come out with, goth boy clique. And obviously, like after that led to e-girls calling themselves goth and whatever. And you can I don't care how you dress. I don't care how you present. That has never had any issue with me. It's the usage of this verbiage that is so near and dear to so many people's hearts. And so having that misrepresentation coupled with the, I guess the accessibility of fast fashion, like has created an insurgence of people who are more interested in the look and just don't know anything about the music. Because for years it was people, being forced to go out of their way to create this look. Whereas now you can order something online for fairly cheap and get it to you and have the look,
Yeah.
I think that also goth's roots in the punk rock movement, like it's all very anti-capitalist. And so I think that that's my main issue there is, saying that the material can outweigh the ideals and the thoughts and everything of an entire subculture.
I feel like there are people who are just obsessed with labeling themselves as goth. I think just only based off the fashion, because I think as one has said that when, for example, you tell others that all you need to do is listen to the music, or maybe they tell you that they don't really like the goth music and everything, but they do want to be goth and just dress up in goth and everything. Like, sure, you can dress up as goth or anything that you want to be, but for you to force being called goth or just being part of the goth is really just they need to respect what goth is, because if you want to dress up goth, that's okay. But if you do not want to follow with what goth actually is by listening to the music at least, then might as well just I don't know what it is that they might be going on with, but yeah.
No, that's good. I think that's a a good point. And I think, well, yeah, I mean, so implicitly tied into that, kind of the way we present ourselves, the way we kind of try and clock other goths, is the I get personal identity. And identity is, and the way that forms for people has always been a fascination of mine since I started the podcast and before that. So I wanted to make this one of the questions to ask how you kind of personally understand identity and what that means to you, how that comes about. So if everybody wants to chime in on that, that would be great. Karen, if you want to start.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like I came to goth through the music, and to me, that is still always going to be the most important thing within the subculture. Like I've met people who don't have the aesthetic at all, who are very knowledgeable about the music and who like thus would be goths. Like there's this one person on TikTok, Princess Noodly, who has this like super like kind of pastel sort of aesthetic that doesn't really relate to goth very much at all, but like they're very, very knowledgeable about the music and have like posted a lot about it and are clearly passionate about it. And I think like ultimately to me, that is always going to be the most important thing. I think for like my personal like goth identity, again, the music is the most important part, but I do think that a lot of my other like tastes, interests, general worldview do tend to align pretty well with the subculture overall, which is, nice and very convenient for me. But like, I don't think that everybody is necessarily obligated to have exactly the same taste in every single other aspect. I think just liking some of the music is really the most important thing to me. Mm-hmm. But, if I can also enjoy talking about gothic literature or horror films or whatever with my friends who are also goths, then, so much the better.
Right.
So that's really just my thought about goth identity.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point too, that it's not universal and fixed over time and space, because, you mentioned the gothic literature. That was a huge, at least in my specific area, when I was getting into goth, that was a big deal, where people, to the point where people were, when we're talking about like, what is goth? How do you become goth? What's important to goth identity? Reading gothic literature was either the first or second thing people mentioned. And when I would go to parties and be having conversations at 2 a.m. in somebody's kitchen, somebody would eventually bring up some sort of, even if it wasn't like a classical author, something recent, like, or more recent at the time, like Anne Rice or Poppy Z. Bride or something. That was a huge deal. So yeah, it's definitely, there's a fluidity to that as well, I think. Doe, what are your thoughts?
So, I love Princess Noodly. I just have to say that so much. She's amazing.
That's a great, I love that name. I haven't seen her before, but yeah.
So like Kieran was saying, some of the best conversations that I've ever had about goth music with people have been people that you would see on the street and not think that they're goth people. I was working at Hot Topic one time, and this guy comes in and he's like, do you have Joy Division? Do you have The Cure? Do you have Bauhaus? And we got to talking for like pretty much my entire shift about music, about bands we've seen. And this is just a guy that if you were walking past him, you would just think that he's a guy. So I think that there's some things that, would kind of draw someone to that lifestyle. Different things about their personality, like a lot of goth people that I know tend to like bats. They tend to like vampires. I hate vampires. I'm a werewolf person. I apologize.
That's okay.
No. But like liking darker colors, things like that. And I think that, like I said, there's things that would make people more inclined to be goth versus someone that's not into these things. And On a slightly unrelated note, people will usually tell me things like, I don't have the confidence to dress like you, but my appearance and my the way that I look is a way that I've wanted to look since I was a child, and
Mm-hmm.
it's something that like I gain my strength from and my confidence from. It's always something that I've internalized for myself. Like I know appearance doesn't matter, but to an extent it does. If you look the way that you want to look, you're going to be more confident, regardless if you feel that it's an important aspect to the community or not. A lot of goths do tend to have specific things to their style, like all black clothing, teased hair. Not saying that, again, not saying that you need these things to be goth, but a lot of goths do have that. Um, and looking the way that I look kind of makes me forget any sort of negative attention. So if you're
Mm.
listening to this and you are like, I can't do that, I don't have the strength, just try it out. Try one thing out, you know?
Yeah, I think one of the things as far as the whole power of the appearance side of things is it's not necessarily what you look like, but it's the fact that you get to choose what you look like. It's the sense of
Mm-hmm.
agency where I'm not letting other people dictate how I appear. I am able to choose that on my own. And I think that's what I think leads to a lot of that confidence you're expressing is this fact that I got to do my own thing and I didn't have to bend to anybody else's whim to do it. And that makes me powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you don't feel like you have to look like this or you don't want to look like this, by all means, if you just want to listen to the music, that's perfectly fine. That's all that matters in the long run. I'm gonna have more in common with someone that listens to goth music than someone that just listens or just dresses the same way I do at the end of the day. So
I think that my relationship to my identity in general and with goth culture is definitely different because of that familial aspect that I have.
Mm-hmm.
I'm extremely close with my mother. And so I feel like for me, with or without my personal interest in goth culture, it has always been a very comforting thing for me. Those themes have always been more comfortable for me in general. So maybe I was predisposed, but I like to think that I present myself as authentically as I can. And bouncing off of what Dank Sinatra said, like dressing the way that I do gives me confidence. You know, it makes me feel at home in myself, regardless of my love of goth music, you know? I feel like just allowing yourself to play and see other facets, because humans are multifaceted, allows you to become more comfortable in your identity, whether it be, you know, more focused on one theme or you are diverse, you know, like I feel like for me, it's just a comfort thing, you know?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I think I'm just in the background thinking someone needs to make a Cemetery Confessions bingo card because we've already hit two of the most common subjects, which are commodification and authenticity. And it's just funny to me that these are coming up in conversation, completely disconnected to Trey or myself. But that's just an in joke for myself. So no, I like that. That was a really good perspective. Kimberly, what's your relationship with your identity and the way you think about it?
So, where I see my goth identity is I see it as something that I I like to express externally and through music. I think what I love about it is that it broadens my creativity through the dance and the fashion. And with the dance, it's actually because I love goth dancing. It's really just very free spirit and you know, there are no rules to it. So you just do what you want. And I actually pretty love that. And it honestly makes me happy to be able to express myself this way and feel confident doing it as well. Like, for example, expressing myself with uh, genres like ethereal wave or neoclassical dark waves, because like I did say, it does captivate my soul. I think the celestial feeling from it is it's really euphoric to me, where it feels like it makes me feel what okay, I think I'd say maybe traditional, because it elevates my whole understanding to just any kind of music, because it's really uplifting to me. But I also realized that as time went by as being goth, neoclassical dark wave was something that I decided to explore more in my experience of being goth. So I think it's a very beautiful thing for me to be able to express myself through fashion. It makes me feel loved as well, because with my mom, my mom's Christian, and she actually does not have any problem with me being goth. So I actually do really appreciate that so much, because I was actually very um I was afraid that maybe she wouldn't be accepting of me or anything of that sort. But I was pretty that was actually very comforting to me, that I was able to just talk about it with my mom. I think her being very interested in just me being goth was something that I really appreciated. So I was actually very thankful that I was able to, discover goth,
Yeah.
because I think being goth also just helped me um, form like a deeper connection with my mom in a way, because the interest that she actually took in it was something that actually got us to just talk more. And I think her being um interested in my life was actually a very nice thing.
That's great.
Yeah, that is beautiful.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to touch on Kimberly mentioned dancing, and I feel like it would be silly of me not to mention goth dancing, as that's where all of my TikTok notoriety came from, was showing goth dances that my mom had taught me. And I feel like the essence of goth dancing is just like losing yourself and really
Absolutely, it
feeling
is.
the music. And allowing yourself to maybe look a little silly, I guess. I think it's graceful.
Yeah.
I think it's beautiful. And I think that like in having this experience with TikTok and having like introducing a lot of people to traditional goth dancing, like people saying that I give them the confidence to dance, like that is just as affirming in my identity. Like as the dance itself, and being able to just express myself through movement, even though it can be hard for me, like I said, with the chronic pain conditions. But it's like it's that important to my identity that it's a continuous and ever-present thing.
Yeah, I will say I think I bookmarked all of those videos, and they were really affirming to me as well, because a lot of, I don't see people dancing like that as much at clubs, but almost all of those dances that you presented were my experience in the early 2000s, going out and dancing and seeing other people dance. And so it was really wonderful to me to see that generational thing being carried on. And like you say, I also agree, it doesn't have to be those dances. It is about embracing your cliches, embracing the silliness of it, the bringing out and expressing yourself in whatever way you would like. And I think that's a really beautiful. And Trey, I know you completely agree. I've seen you dance, so I know.
Well, I was just going to point out that as far as the ridiculous side of things, I think there's just a sort of I consider it a negative aspect of the culture at large, at least in America, of any sort of expression of emotion outside of certain parameters is oftentimes viewed as embarrassing or ridiculous. because we're supposed to kind of sort of keep that in, especially as it merges with, of course, toxic masculinity and that other side of men, or at least male presenting individuals, expressing emotions of passions of things other than the desire to get laid. That seems to be the only passion that traditional toxic masculinity seems to encourage. But the idea that when you are gesticulating in a strong dramatic gesture to express these emotional things that you're feeling from the music is something that a lot of people fear looks ridiculous. But in my experience, most of the responses I get to that is people being very excited about it, or like, oh, I can't believe that, that's so freeing. And they're expressing their own reticence of doing it, but the aspiration to be willing to put themselves out there, to be willing to lay their soul bare like that in a public setting. And I think that's part of what it is that the idea of laying your soul bare in front of strangers is what's viewed as scary or ridiculous. And I think that's just a hang up a lot of people kind of need to come to terms with.
And that's such a good point that you brought up too about like emotional expression and toxic masculinity and gender. Because like for me, like I'm a non-binary trans man, and I think for me, like being able to have that freedom within goth has been really good because like I'm sort of like male adjacent kind of in terms of my like identity and my like sense of inner self, but I'm a very emotional person as well. And I think for me, having that outlet to be able to express that without it necessarily being a thing that would cause my gender to be called into question, at least not by like people within the goth scene, has been so freeing because I've been able to kind of keep this part of myself that I was a little bit more allowed to express before I started transitioning. And I think like goth is a really good space for that. Like I used to kind of joke that like my gender presentation isn't male or female. Like I'm not dressing as a man or a woman, I'm dressing as a goth.
Yeah.
And I think that's very like, it's a very like great thing to be able to have that in terms of like, since we're talking about identity, in terms of like gender and gender identity. I think it offers a lot of freedom that I think kind of gets taken for granted sometimes.
I'm so sorry.
No, you're fine.
The roots of goth and like being able to explore your gender identity, like seeing at least through my mom's eyes and her words, like how available the conversation about masculinity and femininity and the expression of masculinity and femininity in whatever way you choose is just so much more accepted, at least in my personal experience. And I think that people forget how interwoven like queer people in general and the goth scene are. They're hand in hand, I feel like a lot of the time.
Yeah.
I think that is a great segue into the big one of the big questions, which is goth political?
You're really just trying to fill out that bingo card now.
We are. Take a drink. Everyone take a shot.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like, my opinion about goth is like, it's political, but it's not political in the more overt way that like punk would be. Like punk, I mean, like one of my punk friends, I remember when the lead singer of a punk band was outed as like a really awful person who had done terrible things to people. One of my punk friends climbed up on stage at that band's show and literally punched him in the face. I couldn't really imagine that happening so easily with goth.
Yeah, who's doing that at some Sombre shows? I'll give you no, actually I can't even make that joke because I'll get in trouble. But yeah,
like something like that happening in punk is like, you know, not particularly surprising. I think it would be a bigger deal in goth if something like that were to happen. But I also like don't think that goth is not political. I mean, it does have those punk roots and it has maintained some of those values. I mean, you listen to some like Sisters of Mercy lyrics and there are like allusions to socialism and communism in some of those lyrics. And then, you listen to a lot of modern goth stuff, and yeah, you still get things like that. Like Susie Sabotage has Nazi goths fuck off. Like I think having things like that, like, and also just looking at how goth does approach things like gender, and the fact that it is a nonconformist culture that is inherently kind of pushing back against more conservative social values. I think you look at that and it's like, well, obviously it's political, but at the same time, you do get like Nazi goths from time to time. And I think you even get that with punk, although like I think punk in the 80s definitely had a response to that was to meet it with violence, whereas goth didn't really do that. I've definitely seen people say like, oh, well, goth is like completely apolitical. It's just escapist. And I don't agree with that.
It's always a conservative who says that. It's never anyone else. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. But yeah, it's like that, like I think there's this emphasis on like DIY, this opposition to commodification, which like whether people want to admit that a subculture resisting commodification is anti-capitalist or not, it is. But at the same time, and also like I think like death rock bands oftentimes like embrace a lot of the same kind of political attitude and politics that punk has, because death rock is a lot more closely related to punk music in a lot of ways, which is why you have like anarchist death rock bands and things like that.
Yeah.
But I also think though that like it's important for us to keep in mind that we can't just go into a goth space assuming that every single person there is going to be totally chill about these things, because they aren't always.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's not really acceptable anymore, but for a while, like goth Nazi fashion was a thing. I've definitely had experiences, mostly online, but I have had experiences where people have had pretty worrying behavior regarding what they considered to be acceptable in goth spaces politically, and what they didn't think was acceptable. Like, I think it's important that we keep in mind that like not everybody who's involved in the subculture is necessarily going to have those kinds of values, and is necessarily like not everybody in it is necessarily going to be anti-bigotry and things like that. But I also do think that the subculture as a whole, the vast majority of people that I've met within it, and also just everything about how it's been put together is like pretty left-leaning politically overall. And then there are also bands like Banshee is like this new band in Ireland that some of the proceeds for certain shows or songs that they've put out have gone towards charities that promote trans rights or that help trans people. Or you've got people like, I don't know, like you've got people, like I said, like death rock bands that maybe mesh some of that DIY stuff with anarchist DIY stuff and maybe get into mutual aid and things like that. Like, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that that stuff is definitely there, even if goth is also escapist.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think you can really have an apolitical scene without crypto fascists and abusers and people that are transphobic kind of taking over or being allowed. I mean, that already happens with YouTubers and DJs and promoters and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I agree. Having conversations about being implicitly and explicitly anti-racist and anti-capitalist and those kinds of things are important. But I don't want to talk too much. Yeah, Dank Sinatra, go ahead.
Okay, so it was brought up goth is derived from punk. So yeah, the foundation basically is very left-leaning / leftist. But at a goth night, no one's gonna be like, you're a Republican or you voted for this politician, so you can't come in. Like, I just don't see that happening. However, I feel like a lot of the resistance that is met towards goths that claim to be right wing is more so done on a personal scale. rather than, like punk, where it's pretty much like you get forced out of punk if you say something like racist, transphobic. I don't really see I see goths doing that more as like a, hey, that's messed up, but no one's gonna be like, I do see it happening actually, where people are like, you're not goth if you're this, you're not goth if you're that. But at the end of the day, like, there's no huge, except for one person who I'm not going to name, that keeps trying to like weasel their way back into the internet. I'm sure we know who this person is.
I think I can think of more than one personally. But yeah.
But yeah, like I feel like when someone in the goth community is, racist, transphobic, right wing, they have to be really racist, really transphobic, or really right wing before that even happens. So yeah, the foundation is very leftist and left leaning, but at the end of the day, like, it's not like punk where people are going to be like, you can't do this, like, on a larger scale.
Pandora.
I agree with both like Joe and Kieran 100%, but also like unfortunately there are facets of bad people that have in times taken refuge within goth or tried to within punk, skinheads, etc. Um, I feel like we have to remember like Peter Steele,
Huh.
racist asshole, like wish he would just only open his mouth to sing, you know?
Mm.
Like it's not a perfect subculture, but it definitely is very left leaning. And I feel like most goths approach issues in a more like a conversational way. Goths are more prone to want to talk it out or make art about it and then talk about it afterwards,
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of goths tend to be lovers, not fighters. And that's really the only difference between the reaction, say, between a punk and a goth scene encountering a bigot.
Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize that and also maybe think about how the tendency to intellectualize ideological positions can inadvertently platform bigots that are, have ideas about certain types of people shouldn't have rights or shouldn't exist or whatever. And that's maybe something that as a community we need to definitely do better on. Kimberly, what are your thoughts about goth being political?
Uh, I think what Pandora had said about goths being loving and everything, I totally agree because yeah, I think that's how it is with punks. Well, punks, as we know, they are rebellious and usually with violence and everything. But with goths, it's like we're basically like against all the hate and violence and everything because we are more softer than punk, even though we did derive some inspiration from punk. We are different in a lot of ways than punk.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for for it to say that goth is political, I don't totally agree that it is political. But yes, you may come across goths that are political. But that doesn't make goth political. As we know, I do know that they may have political ranging from the left liberal to anarchist and but yeah, I don't think they express them in a way that's going to be cultural identity. I don't know if that's making sense, but
Yeah.
it's in like instead of political affiliation or any of that is seen as a matter of personal conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike Unlike punk, yes, unlike punk, there are a few clashes between political affiliation and being goth.
Mm-hmm. Just very, very briefly, it probably comes down also to what you think is political, or how you describe what is political, because in my mind, everything is political to some degree, because politics is a way of legislating ways of being, more or less. So queer bodies are political, black bodies are political. If you're someone with a womb, like, we make laws about what you're allowed to do. We make laws about what your bathroom you're allowed to go to. So I think art is political. Just being in, if you have a goth night at a gay bar, that's political, right? Because we're talking about who can get married and who can have certain types of healthcare, and these systemic decisions. I think when you're out in the world in a certain way, that when that is legislated and there are systems in place to control, to marginalize or normalize those types of being, to me, that makes it political as well, even if it's not an explicit, we're talking about banned lyrics or protests or organized action or that kind of thing. Okay, so let me, just for the sake of time, let's make this either the last question or we'll see how it goes. And that is to the one that's always a fun one, your thoughts on the words gatekeeper and the word poser and what those mean to you. And maybe let's go in the backwards order this time. So Kimberly, if you want to share your thoughts about how that looks for you.
I think people that gatekeep I think it's because they would either gatekeep because some people would not either meet up with their standards on what goth could actually be or how goth should be, which really there's no. Okay, in terms of gatekeeping, I'd say with music, some people may just choose not to correct someone that's not educated on music and or what goth really is and the understanding of goth. So I think I think it's really insane how people may choose not to educate other people because they do not meet up to their standards on how goth they look or how not goth they look. So it's really just a failure to educate other people on the subculture, which it's really sad for people to actually deal with. And I think this is what also prevents other people from learning what goth actually is, and they may be misled by other information elsewhere because someone just decided to gatekeep. Or
Right.
Yeah, I also think that maybe someone who chooses to gatekeep either just does not have the right information on what they know about goth, because I know that most of the goths that I have come across, and none of them would actually gatekeep because they would know exactly how it is to be goth or their experiences. And we've all been baby bats before, so you'd obviously want to help someone or educate someone else that's not goth yet, and just and with posers now, posers can be, that's quite a handful. I just think I think with posers it's just them ignoring or disagreeing on other people educating them or trying to educate them on what goth really is. They may only be interested in the fashion and all that and nothing else. But sometimes, for example, e-girls, most people would, well, I think it goes back to maybe I say 2019 or 2020. Most people would assume that all e-girls are, say, goths. And
Yeah.
they too would say that they are goths and all that, but really they weren't. And it was just their failure to educate themselves on what goth really is. I mean, they have this usually dark look and or just black lipstick and green, mostly green, yes, mostly green. And most of that is really just their ignorance on failure to educate themselves. But I think this also goes back to how gatekeepers would also prevent, yeah, gatekeepers would not educate other people. And who knows, maybe sometimes they can actually become posers.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, those are my thoughts.
That's a good perspective. Pandora, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, when it comes to gatekeeping, I feel like gatekeeping is something that primarily is experienced online.
Hmm.
At least in my experience, in any goth scene that I've ever been to, if you go up to a person and have an in-person interaction with them and show genuine interest, most of the time they're gonna tell you, But there's that distinction online, where people either choose to, I feel like gatekeeping comes with a bit of arrogance in a way, um, believing that some people are more worthy than others to learn or have access to information. But I also want to make the distinction between, being a private person and maybe not answering someone's comment
Hmm.
and gatekeeping. Because the internet and real life are two different things, whether they do coincide, obviously, and they have effects on others, but like a lot of people, when it comes to like gatekeeping within the goth community, it's often referred to like gatekeeping where you got clothes or gatekeeping this music, blah blah blah. Like I lost my train of thought again. At least I'm honest about it every time. Let's see.
No, that's good. It is
Um,
also, if you have
yeah,
ADHD, it is a
I
test of
do.
endurance to like pay attention this long.
Yeah, no, it's definite, and it's hard to articulate yourself
Oh
well
yeah,
for
absolutely.
a long period of time.
Yeah.
But in reference to posers, I feel like, we touched on before how important music is to the goth subculture and how so many people that are knowledgeable about um, the music may not even present externally as goth. Um,
Hmm.
but those are people that you might think of when you think of the term poser, but I don't feel like that is what an actual poser is. Um, I feel like a poser is someone who uses goth to further their own ideals and
Hmm.
is, like Kimberly said, uh, I'm going to say willfully ignorant about
Right.
it. If they reject the education, they reject the conversation, I feel like that's when you come to the status of being a poser, quote unquote.
Yeah. Yeah. Doe, what are your thoughts?
Alrighty, so I think the term gatekeeper is extremely overused. I think that a lot of people who are called that are just called that for simply even mentioning goth music. I had a video that was reposted to Instagram, which no issue, they credited me. But I got this comment saying that like I'm being a gatekeeper because it was my things I wish I knew as a baby bat or
Mm.
something like that
Hmm.
video. And the first point was I should have focused more on my music knowledge rather than my style because the music is what's important. And someone was basically like, oh, you're a gatekeeper because what if some people don't like goth music? And I'm like, then they're not goths. like at the end of the day, they're not. But yeah, I just think that that's a term that's completely overused. I think that a lot of people don't know what it actually means. Saying like you need to listen to goth music. Here are some bands that you might like. Here are some like if you like this kind of music, you might like this goth genre is the complete opposite of gatekeeping, actually. That's like leaving the gate wide open. And as far as Poser, I'm gonna say his name because he was brought up before. Jake Monroe. He will use the word goth to profit. Like he uses it on his merch, like goth boy, goth this, goth reacts to this on YouTube all the time. But then he's always trashing goths and he's always saying that goth music sucks and this, that, and the third. So I have absolutely no qualms against calling him a poser since, like I said, he will use the community for himself to profit. And at the end of the day, he's going to sit there and say that goths are this, goths are that, and I hate goths. I think he actually had a video where that was the title at one point.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, which was, I think, mostly him complaining about people saying he's not goth because he doesn't like goth music or whatever, which is like, oh, I'm not even going to get into it. We'll be here for another hour. Yeah. Maidenless behavior, yeah. Kieran, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that these terms do tend to get misused sometimes, but that they do have a place. Like I think gatekeeper is a term that like people do, like you said, have a tendency to kind of use it for anybody that just tries to educate you about goth sometimes. Like I've seen it used a lot of times against people who are just trying to very politely educate other people about the fact that like, yeah, it is a music-based subculture. Here are some bands and things like that. I also think like, you know, posers are a thing that do exist, but I also think that that's a term that I've seen used against people who are just baby bats who actually do want to learn and who are actually curious, but they just don't know things yet, or they make a mistake, because everybody makes mistakes when they're just getting into it. And I think that is a term that sometimes gets unfairly applied to people in that situation, which is just really shitty. And I think that, yeah, what an actual gatekeeper is somebody who like isn't going to tell you where to find out new music. They're like, no, you have to find out yourself, or no, I'm not sharing, or whatever. Like, I know that based on just stories that I've heard from other goths who were around in the 90s, apparently that was a much bigger thing then than it is now.
Yeah. But
I do think it's still a thing that does exist. It's just not very common. As for posers, like, yeah, I think everything that all of you said is pretty spot on. Just people who don't really have an interest in learning about the music and use the subculture like for their own ends without actually wanting to really engage with it or really be a part of it. Like, yeah, I think that's pretty much exactly right.
You're not a poser just because you don't know how to pronounce Cocteau Twins.
Right. Oh, also something I also wanted to mention that I forgot to talk about when we were talking about gender and political stuff is that I think it's important for goths to be aware right now that with a lot of these anti-trans laws, those aren't just going to affect trans people. Those are going to affect cis goths as well, because we do play around with gender, and also just because we're different. Like, if you can label something as drag because the person who's doing it is a cis man wearing makeup, or somebody that you perceive to be a cis man wearing makeup, and that person is doing a performance in public, if that's what a law is saying is drag, then a lot of goth events...
Every goth band.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, this is something to keep an eye on and kind of keep in mind and pay attention to, because I know trans people are very well aware of things like bathroom laws and about how things like our androgynous appearance might affect us if somebody perceives us as trans and decides, oh, that person's a problem, or that person is like breaking some new law that's been passed in whatever state, because there are a lot of states passing these laws right now. But I think a lot of cis goths who haven't maybe been following this as closely because they didn't realize it might affect them might not necessarily be aware, but some of these laws are going to affect you too. So this is one of those areas where goth kind of needs to be political in order to defend not just its members, but itself and its ability to exist as a subculture, because those kinds of things are going to be a challenge for us down the line if we don't address it now.
Yeah, I agree.
One thing I wanted to mention around the whole gatekeeper poser thing is that both terms can have sort of, both a positive understandable aspect as well as the negative sort of manipulative aspect. From the poser, I've already mentioned that you have the posers who are putting on a costume to be manipulative or to get their own devices, right? The ones who are consciously or being willfully ignorant, as was stated. And then also the baby bats, as was also mentioned, that get labeled with that poser label simply because they don't know yet how to fully embody, how to fully be goth, and so can be viewed as a poser for someone who just is doing a knee-jerk reaction. And as far as gatekeeping, one thing I want to mention as far as the positive and negative sides of that, I believe Pandora mentioned the disparity between it being, viewed in real life events versus online spaces, and the idea that gatekeeping was more common in online spaces. One of the ways I see it in real life spaces, apart from the sort of stereotypical purity tests of, do you know the third bassist from this band sort of thing, but there's also a sense, and this is, I think, the more defensible side of gatekeeping, where some gatekeeping is called out for people who are simply trying to preserve a safe space, or trying to are afraid of infiltration, are afraid of commodification, things like that. And sometimes when somebody comes into a space who doesn't look like they belong, rightly or wrongly, there's this fear that someone is infiltrating the space, is going to cause a problem in the space, is going to be a danger to other members in the community. And it's a rooted fear of the outsider to some degree. And while I don't like it as a general thing, I understand it as sometimes a necessary thing, especially depending on the community around that subculture, what the outside community feels as far as is there hostility between the greater community in that region versus the community within the subculture. So there's an aspect of gatekeeping that is positive there, but it does have a tendency to run off the rails, where it's good up to a point, but then it can go too far, become too exclusionary, and it's preventing people who don't know enough to present as appropriate to being accused of being a poser or an infiltrator or a danger to the community. And that's kind of how it tends to arise in real space, as far as my experience.
I do want to just say that I really appreciated everyone's perspective. This has been informative for me and really enjoyable. And so I really appreciate everyone taking time to come on and share their views. I want to have all of you share where people can find you online. Whatever you want to share in that regard. I guess we'll just go in order again. Kieran, where can people find you?
Yes, so I'm at Kieran Creature, so spelled out as Ciaran and then Creature, just all one word, on TikTok, Instagram, and Tumblr. And then I'm at Crow_Creature on Twitter. Or you can just type out Kieran Creature. The second A in Kieran has the fada over it. That's the little accent. And for those of you who speak Irish, you might know it's really more pronounced Kieran, but I just kind of use Kieran generally speaking because most Americans that I encounter, and I'm in the US, understand it better that way. So yeah, so Kieran Creature. Yeah.
I will say I love the way that the historical use of goth pseudonyms has, at least in my personal, I'll just speak for me, my love of that trend in goth has dovetailed with my trans identity and renaming myself. That's been one of my favorite happy coincidences with that. Dank Sinatra, where can people find you?
On TikTok, I'm Dank Sinatra, DXNK Sinatra, as in Frank Sinatra. My Instagram is also the same, but I don't post on that anymore. But I do. If you tag me in something, I'll respond. Yeah.
Awesome. Pandora?
You can find me on TikTok at Pandora Ash spelled with an E. That I just wanted to note that that's my real given name. As cool as it would have been if I changed it.
Yeah.
just thanks, Mom. Perks of having a goth mom. And I'm Panbox, PANBOXX on Instagram. Yeah.
And Kimberly?
I am ECLT Kimberly on TikTok and Instagram. Just that. I don't know. ECLT was just a mysterious name.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as goths do, right? And I'll have, to make it easy for everyone listening, if you just open the notes section of whatever app you're on, or if you're on YouTube or on your phone or whatever, I'll have links to all of everything mentioned, so you can just click it and go there and follow if you would like to. But yeah, that's it. Thank you all again so much for spending time with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. This was a really enjoyable experience.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Good. You had really interesting things to say.
As did all of you. I really appreciate that. Thank you. What a lovely discussion that was. I think, briefly, to expand on something I said earlier that stuck with me when listening to everyone speak, is how incredibly lucky we are to have the scene that we have right now. I think we really take it for granted. Like, I lived through the future pop takeover and cyber goth takeover of goth clubs and music, and the death rock revival and the witch house, new goth, pastel goth era, and the gothic metal era. And the common refrain was, why is goth being bastardized? Why is goth dying? There were many years when goth clubs were shutting down. There were no festivals, no events outside of major cities, and even they were struggling. Actually, there's this quote I came across in the book Worldwide Gothic that I thought was pertinent to this, that I'll read briefly. So this is Raymond from the band Angst talking, and he said, "Angst's keyboard player and I found ourselves being approached constantly by the old school and traditional goths, asking us please to reconsider starting something up again, but we constantly declined. That was until at one of those events that it struck me like a sledgehammer as I sat at my table, watching luminously clad ravers grooving to the pulsing beat of a remix of some obscure bedroom-produced EBM track. I had to ask myself, is this what our precious scene has been reduced to?" And then on another page they say, just Natasha says in commentary, "The problem was, so many cyber resources meant the online goth scene was more spread out than it had been 2 decades ago, and this meant that against all appearances, it wasn't as well connected. And to add further irony to the mix, the bigger goth became online, the smaller its physical presence was in the real world. In fact, the very thing that was goth's lifeline in the 90s ended up sticking it on life support a decade later." So that kind of commentary was what I grew up with, right? And now we are gluttons. People used to beg for trad goth, and now we complain about how promulgated it is, and truly that blows my mind. When I sit down and think about the depth and breadth of music there is right now, to see all the teens and 20-somethings getting into the scene that were missing for a long time, and when the scene was just full of old people only, truly we are spoiled for choice, and I know I take it for granted more days than not, but considering how close my heart is to goth, it really brings me joy to see the scene flourish, and I would encourage you to engage as much as you can while we have what we have, because of course nothing lasts forever. But that's it for us. We will be back in 2 weeks with another music mausoleum, which is going to be focused specifically on music, and we're going to be reviewing the new Belgrado album, talking about new releases from the last month, and of course enjoying Obscura Undead's All Goth Considered. Thank you deeply to everyone who supports us on Patreon for keeping this boat floating down the river Styx, as it were. And I apologize for my voice as of late. My GERD has been much worse than normal, and it affects my throat and the sound of my voice and my ability to speak. So I appreciate you bearing with me and apologize for any annoyance that may have caused. That's it, though, for this episode. Thank you again for spending your time with us, and until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.